the Tenere 700. Man, I have dreamt of trying one of these out ever since the release of the prototype in 2017. And of course, every time I hop on YouTube, it's T7 this, T7 that. So it's kind of just been a constant tease for me whenever I got online for the last 2 years basically, but I finally got my hands on one thanks to my good buddy Cheese Curd. So, having been out for a while now, the masses have kind of already formed their opinions on it. The internet's consensus seems to be that this is the quintessential ADV dual sport bike, and it doesn't get better than this. My goal here today is to walk you through whether or not I think that's true. Spoiler alert, it's entirely dependent on how you're going to use it. First off, a little bit about myself. I'm about 6'7", 250 pounds, so this review is going to be more aimed towards the big and tall riders with lots of focus on ergonomics, but I try to cater to the general viewer as well. I've been riding for roughly 10 years now. I don't really enjoy riding road all that much, although I've owned a few street bikes in the past, one of which being an FJ09, but my favorite stuff is harder technical trails and signal track. I'm by no means an expert, but I definitely have the skill to keep myself upright and moving through some pretty gnarly terrain. I've owned lots of different dual sports, dirt bikes, and adventure bikes. I'll list them all on the screen to check out. Not only that, but I have ridden just about every Japanese dual sport in existence, along with a few KTMs and betas. So, I have a long history riding dual sports, and because of all of this prior experience, I will say, I came in kind of expecting to know what this bike felt like, but it really surprised me in a few ways. By far, the biggest surprise was immediately apparent when I first sat on the bike. My buddy has 30mm risers installed that bring the bars slightly more backwards, but man, the bars are so far forward on this thing and they're very high up compared to all the other bikes I've ridden. Just these 30mm risers alone make this the most comfortable bike I've ever ridden standing up. What a treat to finally find a machine that works this well for my tall frame when standing. Sitting down is another story though. My buddy has a Seat Concepts standard height comfort seat, and my legs were really bent at the knees sitting down. I honestly felt pretty cramped sitting down, although I will say a rally seat and possibly some drop pegs would really help out with this. Surprisingly, the stock pegs, without those stupid rubber inserts, are actually amazing, and the bike is nice and narrow, meaning it's easy to get a grip on while standing, and that's something I really appreciate coming from my Africa Twin. That bike was just so wide where you need to grip with your legs. So ergonomically, if you toss a rally seat and 30mm risers on it, you're looking at one of the best bikes in existence for taller folks, at least in regards to standing up riding. And honestly, I'm considering buying one of these bikes in the future simply because it works so well for my size. The next surprise is just how well planted and stable this bike is. Along with that, it's also incredibly hard to break the back end loose unintentionally, which is just about the complete opposite of my old Africa Twin. I'd basically go quarter throttle on that thing and it was sideways. I actually have some footage of the Africa Twin in some muddy terrain where all it did was break the back end loose where the T7 just hooked. But the ability for the rear end to grip like that makes this thing pretty beginner friendly. For its size, it's unmatched in how it handles. I imagine the KTM 790, 890 probably rival it, but I haven't been able to test one of those out yet, and those are a lot more expensive than the T7 as well. I imagine that the rear tire planting itself so hard is just a feature of the anti-squat mechanism that Fort9 talked so much about in their Tenere 700 video. In some aspects, it does handle just like a big dirt bike, but you'll notice the weight very quickly if the terrain ends up slowing you down or if you drop it. Also, I really appreciate that they actually put some decently dirt capable tires on this machine from the factory. Good on you, Yamaha. Not only that, but the suspension is definitely not dirt bike spec. Suspension for this type of riding, fine. Totally fine. If you're going to be doing any harder riding, I hit some bumps over there where I could definitely feel like it could use an upgrade. Although I didn't get to test it super thoroughly, I would be respringing and revalving this bike almost immediately if it were me. Now, there's definitely one big problem that I have with this machine, and it's not really a fault of the bike, but rather ADV bikes and how they're marketed in general. After watching Paul Torres do the insane he did with his bike. I constantly see people online saying how this bike is capable of anything, a lot of times using it as a basis for their argument for this bike. While yes, that technically is true, this bike can do anything and it's capable of that, Torres is one of the best enduro riders on the planet. He could do anything with probably any of the adventure bikes, while us, the average rider, wouldn't even attempt the stuff he was doing in that video on a dirt bike.
I made that TW200 review and I said that you can take that bike anywhere regardless of your skill level. This bike, depending on your skill level, you can take it anywhere.
What I'm getting at is that if you're a beginner rider looking to get into dirt riding, I highly advise against buying this bike. This is a machine that requires prior experience to ride in the bush. Simply put, this bike has too much power, it's too heavy, can easily break a leg just from a simple standstill drop, and it has a lot more parts to break than a regular dual sport or dirt bike. Just run out, buy a cheap old dirt bike or dual sport to practice on that first. It'll save you a lot of headaches in the long run. I will say though, in the right hands, ADV bikes are extremely rewarding, with road abilities that rival street bikes and dirt abilities, on this bike especially, that rival even the smaller dual sports. But an untrained wrist will likely find themselves in a lot of trouble on this bike. While yes, Mr. Torres did all that crazy and made it look really easy, you have to remember that's all marketing on Yamaha's part. It's the same deal with Chris Birch and KTM and Tony Bao and Honda. They're the best riders on the planet, and they intentionally place them on those bikes to make you think that you'll be capable of doing the same stuff. Having stated my issues with ADV bikes in general, we'll move on to a couple of things I don't like about the bike itself. My main gripe with this bike is how the exhaust is mounted. Man, even if you have a simple standstill drop, that thing would be a liability. Where the can itself mounts looks flimsy as hell, and how it's routed is just dumb. If you drop this bike on the right side, the swing arm will contact the exhaust. If this were my bike, I'd be getting a rally exhaust from Camel ADV or something similar ASAP. Which is a shame because I think the bike sounds great in stock form.
Okay.
I noticed after doing some research on the bike that this is already a well-documented issue and really seems to be the only major gripe besides the dash wobble, which doesn't really bother me one bit, to be honest. I don't look at the dash at all while I'm off-roading. My next negative of this bike is related to ergonomics, and we touched on this already, but this is going to be more specific. It's the seat. How it positions you and how it's sloped just sucks in my opinion. Although the sloping part is going to be more subjective, I'm a fan of flat seats. The bike is just really cramped sitting down in stock form, but like I said, a rally seat would really help out some with this. Moving on, I would not be buying this bike as my primary off-road machine. For some people that's obvious, but there's just way too much extra motor sticking out to brake in a simple drop. The water pump and engine cases specifically on this bike stick out really far, meaning there's a lot more potential of your bike leaving you stranded out in the middle of nowhere. This is one category where a DR650 or another big single would simply be a better choice. So if you're doing a multi-thousand-mile trip with some pretty gnarly terrain, that's definitely something to think about. Proper bike protection would definitely lessen the chances, but even with crash protection, it just lessens the chances. It does not prevent it. Now, when I talk about the bike being able to get me home, I'm in no way referring to the fueling or overall reliability of this bike. The motor and fueling on this bike is bomb-proof, just as basically all modern Japanese bikes are. I've owned multiple fuel-injected Japanese bikes now, and they're basically flawless in terms of reliability. Having owned many carb bikes as well, I can tell you, unless it's Electron or a smart carb, I'm never switching back. EFI is just vastly superior in every way in my opinion. I even find EFI to be simpler to diagnose and fix. Changing a fuel pump or injector on my WR250R is a 15 to 30 minute job, whereas pulling the carb and cleaning it on my old DRZ was much more labor intensive, mainly because the airbox had to be moved to get to the carb. I don't know why, but people online get the idea that carbs can be fixed in the middle of nowhere. The only way that's true is if it's a clogged jet. Either that, or you're carrying a carb rebuild kit on you at all times. Basically, all I'm trying to get at is that EFI is very reliable now. Don't worry about your bike randomly breaking down in the middle of nowhere. So, who is this bike for? This bike is for the guy that wants one bike to do everything decently. It does road pretty well and it does dirt pretty well. In spirit, this bike is essentially a KLR 650 on steroids. For a 50/50 machine, it doesn't get much better than this. Even though there's more to break, I'd take this over a KLR 650 or DR 650 every day of the week. Who shouldn't buy this bike? Do not buy this bike if you want something for primarily off-road riding. This is not a dirt bike. It's a 450 pounds dual sport. There are better bikes out there for the guy who wants to ride almost all off-road. There's simply too much to break and too much weight to break you for a bike to be primarily off-road. I also wouldn't buy this bike as a road touring bike specifically. You have to remember, this bike is fairly light, so it's going to get badgered by winds at higher speed a lot more. Plus it's really narrow, so that doesn't help with rider comfort at speed. Also, by the standards of road bikes, this bike does not have a lot of power. There's just much better bikes out there for the guy who wants to ride only road. So, having gone through all that, do I think this bike lives up to the hype people are giving it? Yes and no. It's definitely not the be-all, end-all dual sport that people are making it out to be, in my opinion. And even as a 50/50 machine, it's not perfect. But damn, does it come close. Thanks for watching, guys. If you liked the video, please subscribe, like, and comment. If you didn't like the video, feel free to dislike and harshly criticize me in the comments. I get off on your negativity. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.